All right, good morning. Let's get started with our first panel. Listen Up and Be Persuaded, Archives of Interpellation. Little Althusser thrown in there for good measure. I promise probably the last time I repeat my mantra. We're up to 36 doctors, 4 missing. So again, bring in your relatives, whoever, you know. It's like we're happy to accept everyone with a PhD. So to moderate the panel, we have Salma Siddique, and I'll cede the panel to you, please.
Good morning. We have two very interesting speakers with us for this panel. Our first speaker is Christian Ferencz-Flatz, who's a philosopher and research scholar at the University of Bucharest and a teacher at Bucharest's National University of Theatre and Film. Christian's research concerns phenomenology, critical theory, the philosophy of history, and film and media philosophy. His monographs include Critical Theory and Phenomenology, Polemics, Appropriations, Perspectives, and also Film as Social Situation. Together with filmmaker Radu Jude, he is the co-author of the found footage film, 8 Postcards from Utopia, and he's promised me that he'll show a portion of it today. He's currently developing a research project devoted to post-socialist advertising, and today he's going to talk about the sound of advertising films in post-socialist Romania. Our second speaker today is Tom Rice, who's a professor in film studies at University of St. Andrews, Scotland. He's the author of White Robes, Silver Screens, Movies, and the Making of the Ku Klux Klan, and his second book, Films for the Colonies, Cinema, and the Preservation of the British Empire. He previously worked as a senior researcher on a major archival project on British colonial film and has extensive experience working with global archives, most recently through his network on film strips. And he will discuss the lost art of film strip presentation, a precursor to TikTok videos. So I welcome you both to the stage, and we'll begin with Christian.
No, this is not mine. Can I close it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you, Salma. Many thanks to the organizers for having me here. Unfortunately, I prepared a way too long presentation, so I will just live narrate it and try to keep it short. So, okay, what I wanted to present here today mainly relates to the two projects, the two intersecting projects that Salma mentioned earlier. On the one hand, it has to do with a research project that we are currently developing and that we have submitted for funding. We're currently awaiting a decision with regard to funding any day now. And it's a research project that has to do with advertisement films from the post-socialist period. We're a group of film scholars, critical theorists, social historians, and so on. And we basically want to look at post-socialist advertisements as this unique historical resource that does a bunch of things at the same time. On the one hand, it of course reflects the intense social, economic, cultural transformations that the country underwent during this period, but it also highlights the hopes, the anxieties, the fears, and so on that were infusing the society during this period. And we argue at the same time they also actively contributed in shaping the way things were evolving during this time. So, of course, this project has not yet actually begun, so I won't be able to present any real outcome of this project. But on the other hand, this project developed out of an entirely different kind of project, namely the film project that Salma mentioned earlier. It's a found footage film titled 8 Postcards from Utopia, which premiered in Locarno a couple of months ago, and which also has to do with post-socialist advertising. It is assembled out of post-socialist advertisements. Well, we have been working on this project for the past 6 years or so, and basically for a large part of this period, we were struggling to actually get our hands on these materials, which are not kept institutionally anywhere. There's no institution actually responsible in holding them, and moreover, many of the actors involved in producing and in circulating these films, be they agencies or commissioning companies or even the early television studios working during the early transition period, many of them are either long gone or absorbed into other companies while their archives went astray or they were lost. So what we had to do basically was actually do this sort of grassroots work and go to the people that were involved in producing and circulating them, and who might, we believed, have some form or some version or some of these films. And well, it was a long work, but it basically resulted in us now having a pretty big archive of several hundreds of hours of advertisements produced in the post-socialist period. And we did our thing with it in this film, but at the same time, we wanted to do more, and this is how the basic research project that I mentioned came into being. Okay, so what I will try to present today is an attempt to bring both together, or to balance these two, the research and the artistic perspective, so to say. And I will try to do so in a theoretical orientation. Broadly, I gave my presentation the title, The Voice of Advertising, and I want to focus mostly on, I'm drawing mostly on Adorno on the one hand and on Don Ide on the other hand. Adorno because well, of course, there's a lot of voices present in advertisements, but I'm trying to use the term in a more general sense, the way Adorno himself did in some of his early papers. For instance, an essay from his earliest US period, which is titled The Radio Voice, and where he very broadly conceives the radio voice as being a definitory feature of more or less everything that is coming out of the radio, be it people speaking, or music, or entertainment shows, or whatever. He has this very paradoxical statement that the radio speaks to its listeners even when they don't listen to an actual speaker. And well, in Adorno's view, basically this acoustic physiognomy and pervasive mode of address that is characteristic of radio allows speaking of the radio as such, as if it had a human voice, in a way similarly to the way you would consider a car having a face, or an object having a face. So what he proposes is this sort of physiognomic analysis of how the radio speaks, so the voice of radio in this specific sense, claiming that in the case of radio, this how entirely envelops the what exactly is being said in the radio. Okay, I won't go so far as to say that advertisements speak to their listeners regardless of whether someone is actually speaking in them or not, but I am trying to develop a similarly broad concept. And moreover, in doing so, and this brings me to my second reference, namely to Don Ide, I'm trying to show that in developing this sort of analysis of the voice of advertising, of advertisements, this can contribute a further chapter to phenomenologist Don Ide's insightful accounts of what he terms the dramaturgical voice. Now, as you might well know, in Ide's now classical work, Listening and Voice, he, among other things, also engages in a detailed analysis of the ways the sounding voice can be existentially amplified or emphasized, and this is what he calls the dramaturgical voice, placing it midways between, on the one hand, the trivial transparency of speech in ordinary conversation, and on the other hand, the enchantment of music, which he says totally absorbs and envelops the listener. Specifically, Ide uses the concept of the dramaturgical voice to look at the various modes in which amplifying the sounding or musical aspect of the voice, that is, the way it is bodily performed as a sound event, also contributes to heightening its uttered significance, elevating it above the ordinary. Among the various possible ways in which this can occur, according to Ide, he particularly singles out three, namely the masked voice of drama, he says, which allows the actor to make present another persona, the elevated voice of liturgy, which makes emphatic use of sound to evoke the invisible presence of a deity, and finally, the celebratory voice of recited poetry, which allows renewing the ordinary of everyday life by extending voice, among other things, to mundane things and lifeless objects. This selection, which is obviously limited and not exhaustive, is explicitly driven in his case by a philosophical intention. For Ide, in principle, acknowledges the long-standing tradition of suspicion fostered by philosophers against the dramaturgical aspects of voice, thus illustrated, which often betray reason and significance for the sake of overpowering the listener in various ways. Instead, Ide says, in our present theoretical context, marked by what he terms voiceless and disembodied reason, abstract thought and objectivity as promoted by contemporary scientism, it is on the contrary a duty for the philosopher to also stress the existential and bodily dimensions of voice by looking at the ways in which intonation, inflection, accent, stress, vocal expressivity, and so on also contribute to and modulate the declarative aspect of significance. In this regard, drama, liturgy, and poetry are for Ide the perfect examples, insofar as they are all three selectively tuned on the sensuous aspect of how the voice is performed, beyond what is actually declared or argued, while they at the same time meaningfully allow countering the deep-rooted philosophical suspicion against rhetoric expressivity. Consequently, it is pretty clear, on the one hand, why the advertising voice, with its myriad ways of subtly influencing the listeners, would not make it into such a selection, as it is clear, on the other hand, that the use of voice in advertising itself nonetheless constitutes a unique form of dramaturgical voice, of amplified sounded signification, which is aimed precisely at persuading, alluring, arousing the listener. In order to describe this in Ide's own general terms, one could take various paths. For instance, one could refer to the way advertisements create elevated significance by transplanting suggestively sounding but meaningless in themselves brand names into the trivial transparency of everyday conversations. Equally, one could look at the way slogans usually employ modes of acousmatic address for giving authority to their proclamations of quality, or the way they extend voice to products by their extensive use of personificatory language, or the way they facilitate viewer identification by their use of what Michel Chion terms the I voice, or the way they also make use of poetic emphasis on the sensuousness of sound by extensively employing repetition, alliterations, wordplay, in order to amplify significance in often liminal ways beyond what is explicitly declared, and so on. Instead, the path I will try to follow here is to try and put some historical meat on this general perspective on the advertising voice, and I will try to do so by specifically looking at the advertisements from the 1990s and try to contrast them a bit to what was going on before them. Why? Because advertisements, actually, and the advertisement culture of the 1990s did not really come into a void when it occurred in 1990. As has already been studied extensively, state socialist countries did indeed make a unique and paradoxical use of advertising themselves. And of course, this was, in a certain sense, problematic insofar as, in this particular context, the production of goods was not primarily driven by profit. Theoretically, their distribution was not pressured by competition. The products were usually not branded, and so on and so forth. So all these were actually reasons for not actually having advertising in any form during the socialist period. We know that this was actually not the case, that they actually used advertising quite a lot. And what theorists during this period basically tried to do is to sort of rethink advertising along an entirely different set of functions. the function that they mainly focused on was the idea that advertising in a socialist system, in a planned economy, was basically had the task to help match consumption and the habits of consumption to what was being actually produced, to the production plan. So we needed advertisements in a socialist context mainly to bring people to actually consume what the production plan said was needed to being produced during this period, and in general to shape the consumption habits of the populace in various ways. Of course, this was more like an ideal principle, or the sort of ideological terms in which advertising was supposed to be addressed during this period, because in actually looking at what was being produced during this period, there is a very complex dialogue going on between the formats of advertising that are being used and Western models, Western patterns of advertisement. But nonetheless, what you can see when looking at these advertisements is that indeed, they very much resemble in form educational films. So what is very clear from these films is that they work in a manner that brings them very close to educational films. And I would like to show a brief example of one of these advertisements and then discuss a bit the differences to what is going on in the 1990s.
Care poate fi legătura între aceste imagini? Secretul? Cecurile de economii școlare. Primul pas în marea familie a depunătorilor la cec se poate face prin cecurile de economii școlare. Admirabile instrumente de economie, cecurile școlare sunt în același timp un mijloc de îmbogățire a cunoștințelor. Fiecare din cele 10 serii emise de Casa de Economii ilustrează o temă din cele mai interesante domenii de activitate. Astfel, elevii economi știu mai multe, iar dorințele lor se realizează mai ușor. Deprinderea spiritului de economie, îmbogățirea cunoștințelor, realizarea dorințelor prin cecurile de economii școlare.
Okay, so this is a clip that is assembled mostly out of images that you find in other formats of educational or documentary film during the period. But if you specifically look at what is going on at the level of the voice in this clip, I think there are at least three striking aspects. For one, and you see this here explicitly, advertisements from this period typically make use of a third-person voiceover commentary throughout, which makes them from the onset remarkably similar to the average non-fiction format that we also find in educational, in industrial instruction films during this period. Despite the varying individual voice of speakers, and there are a couple of voices that you find throughout in this entire range of productions, they all share not only the same intonations, inflections, rhetorical patterns, but also more significantly, the same suggestion of official, of sanctioned authority. If in contrast, regular capitalist advertisements directly or covertly always give voice to the company advertised ultimately, in the case of state socialist advertising, one might claim that it is ultimately only the state itself who speaks. This common voice ensures a certain unity of intention and address to the entire production of state socialist nonfiction film, despite its various differences of purpose, style, and genre. Its features are hearable, that is given in the specific sound qualities of the voice. The voice speaks in a settled, calm, and neutral tone, abiding by its mainly informative and educational mission. It is a voice primarily filled with paternalist concern for the listener, which takes upon itself the task to guide the populace. The example I gave here might be perhaps a little too self-serving, as it actually refers to a product intended for children, although it is primarily, of course, addressed at parents. But I think the observation holds good for socialist advertisements in general, which indeed monitor their viewers and express satisfaction or dissatisfaction with them in ways quite similar to how parents watch over their children's behavior. In this context, sanctions are usually only devised quite softly, if at all, with some slight sarcasm and retained remarks, but this euphemistic talk usually also hides some veiled hint at the possibility, at least, of a more stern tone and a more acute response. To illustrate this, I would have liked to conclude this short survey with another example, but I will skip this. I will just tell you a bit about it. An example which very well shows both the fluidity of state socialist genres of useful film and these particularities of their common voice. The clip I wanted to show is part of a series of short films from the early 1970s, which begin initially like a very straightforward advertisement for the cinema itself, where they were supposed to be played. Much like, say, contemporary multiplex cinemas include their own ads in the opening commercial sessions. However, things soon take an unexpected twist as the film turns into a traffic instruction documentary proper, warning about the perils of rushing to the cinema. And the voice here is throughout mildly sarcastic, though there are people actually dying in the clip because they have a car accident. And at some point at the end of the clip, the voice sort of makes a reference to, well, the sort of moralizing that you can do about this sort of incident, but a moralizing that they will actually refrain from in this clip. So they keep it sort of neutral, but at the same time suggest other possible approaches. In any case, put in a nutshell, advertisement during this period offer one opportunity among many for the state to regulate, to control, to amend the behaviors of the socialist subject in all respects, including their consumption habits. And it is this common intention that also shines through in the monotony of their uniformous use of the dramaturgical voice. Now, things could not be more different during the transition period. For one, post-socialist advertisements most overtly break with these patterns by making them the explicit object of parody from the onset. Thus, several ads from the early transition period explicitly mock the voice and position of the official announcer, conflating newsperson, educator, and advertiser by often showing the sober newsperson, for instance, at their desk in the TV studio, derailed in funny ways when encountering some product. For instance, in an ad we actually used in our film, this is about shrimp chips, which was a specialty that viewers might have remembered was available for a short period during the 1970s due to the Ceausescu's regime's ties to Vietnam. And what happens is, well, you have a newspaper that discovers that shrimp chips are back in town and begins eating them basically in front of the audience. It's an ad that, on the one hand, evokes some sense of nostalgia, but on the other hand, obviously sets itself apart sharply from this regime of enunciation which pretends to inform and educate with patronizing care their viewer in subjecting the voice of authority to explicit ridicule. Secondly, during the early post-socialist period, we also witness a massive pluralization of voices, opening up, among other things, to minorities, to foreigners, which are sometimes an object for facile comedic effects, but more often than not add to the ever more present allure of foreign brand names and foreign words, which begin to populate the commercials of the period throughout. At a time when even local products needed to at least allude at being Western import goods to sell, the advertisements abound in suggestions of foreign accents and explode in a diversity of voices. Thirdly, with this diversity of personae also comes a diversity of modes of address and correspondingly different employments of the dramaturgical voice. They range from semi-obscene puns to grandiloquent poetic emphases, and from silly songs to fast-paced small-letter reading, also including, among other things, talking with one's mouth full to demonstrate the irresistibility of a product. The striking inadequacy of some of these materials, where you, for instance, see industrial equipment advertised on prime time TV, is now in a way less absurd than it was in the 1980s, when you also had this for a short period, when cultural institutions were pushed into self-funding and had to find their own sort of contracts with the industry during this period. And you can find theater programs, for instance, also including advertisements for industrial products or stuff like that. Well, in the 1990s, this was also happening, but in a way it seems less absurd, because during this context of massive accelerated privatizations, one could claim that advertisements also had the function of somehow fueling the dream of everyone to potentially turn into an industrial entrepreneur overnight. So you advertise privatization all over, so why not buy some industrial equipment as well and become an industrial entrepreneur? As I already mentioned, we are only beginning to explore these materials with our research project, so I wouldn't really venture into any more detailed analysis here. Aside from simply adding that what shines through obviously in all of these features is a sharp break with the earlier paternalist mode of audience engagement and a corresponding strive to project the viewer as a subject of free choice and infinite potential. But even without going into a more thorough analysis here, many of these aspects already strike the viewer when simply watching a bunch of these ads side by side as a visible effect of their pervasive qualities. And it is precisely these effects that Radu Jude and myself tried to tease out in one of the chapters of our film, which I would now like to briefly introduce and then leave you with it. So, as I mentioned, our film tries to test out various ways of reading these advertisements in order to lay bare the latent desires, beliefs, hopes, and fears implicit in them. And we did so basically by building them into different narrative, rhetorical, and logical arches. What resulted was a film with an episodic structure split into 8 and, well, actually 9 short chapters, each of which focuses on a very specific aspect of the aspirational or utopian world projected in these advertisements. In any case, the 6th chapter, which you will see immediately, is titled Found Poetry, and it specifically deals with the spoken language, the sounds, the words, and the voices of these advertisements. Now, the title's reference to this well-known practice in contemporary poetry of assembling poetic works out of pre-existing and usually quite unpoetic materials, as are newspaper clippings, technical instructions, political speeches, or even theoretical texts, is not at all haphazard. The tradition of found poetry goes back a long way, at the very least, to the various forms of Dada collage, and of course our entire film is a work of collage in that spirit, while poets and artists like Kurt Schwitters, Ben Porter, or Brian Joseph Davies kept returning in our conversations. In the meantime, the practice of found poetry has grown into a quite vast enterprise, relying on a specialized journal and involving strict rules with regard to the handling of sources, for instance, and elaborated techniques, as are, among others, erasure, free remix, cut-up, and so on, which we have also made use of to some extent. Moreover, in recent years, found poetry had also increasingly come to be used in academia itself as a form of art-based research in its own right, which allows to assemble various sets of data from theoretical texts to information of various sorts in such a way as to attain some sort of intuitive and emotionally resonant overview of them. This latter aspect was especially relevant for us, as was the fact that advertisements in particular seem to be a source of choice for practitioners of found poetry, ever since Ben Porter or Schwitters himself. For indeed, poetry and advertising share not only a similar strive for an intensified language, making use of parallel tropes and techniques, but they also have a complex history of mutual influences and entanglements. And we ourselves will be, in our upcoming research, also interested to explore the ways in which the new language of advertising has left its imprint on the young Romanian poetry of the 1990s, for instance. Regardless of all these points of convergence, however, one important difference remains between the two, and this is an aspect that keeps coming up in present-day academic discussions of found poetry as well, namely the fact that, in contrast to poetry, advertising usually lacks a similar self-reflexive, self-questioning, and self-critical dimension. And this is precisely what the processing of ads into a poetic form usually supplements. What this means to say then is that turning ads into poetry is not just about making fun of materials which are ostensibly worthless, ridiculous, or unpoetic. Of course, fun is doubtlessly also part of it, both in our film chapter as well as in, say, present-day attempts to build the press conferences of Donald Rumsfeld or similarly Romanian football player Gheorghe Hagi into found poems. But this is not just to ridicule, but also to bring out from them some latent forms of existential reflection, a strive for deeper meaningfulness which comes with the poetic form. And this is more or less what we also try to do in our chapter, in neither just making fun of the formal idiosyncrasies of these materials, their obsessive use of the same rhetorical gimmicks like the tricolon, or their shallow and circular slogans like the taste of the tasty taste, nor just imposing some alien poetic meaning upon this trashy material, but instead bringing out from them a sense of self-questioning concern with language and its penchant for meaninglessness, for communication and its imminent demise, which actually come to the fore in some of the advertisements of our chapter. Okay, I will leave you with the images of this chapter, which is about 6 or 7 minutes. Thank you.
Uneori sunt vesel, alteori sunt trist.
Dar oaspeții sunt oaspeți și petele sunt pete.
Ca să învingi toate greutățile, trebuie să fii în cea mai bună formă, fizică și intelectuală.
Optima, mașina ideală.
Omoară, combate, ucide, țânțarii, muștele, molile, viespile, furnicile, puricii, gândacii din bucătărie.
Defensivă. Agresivă. Adezivă.
Ceva care are același preț scăzut, spală mult mai bine și mai ales are o prospețime de zile mari.
Sănătate, vitalitate, echilibru perfect.
Ceva bun?
Ceva proaspăt.
Ceva special.
Modernă, practică și super finisat.
Și o sârmă. 118 932, salvatul acum!
Cu tine vorbesc. Niciodată nu auzi ce spun.
Ce e dincolo de cuvinte? Dincolo de cuvinte sunt în primul rând oamenii. Alo?
Alo?
Alo? Alo? Alo? Alo? Alo?
Alo? Alo?
Alo? Alo?
Comunicarea e perfectă.
Nu-i de mirare că toată lumea vorbește.
Niciodată singur, totdeauna sigur.
Produse de mobilier funcționale și elegante care vă vor însoți în călătoriile dumneavoastră imaginare.
Rio și unde ai fi, Rio cer și baby.
Aș vrea să-ți ofer un sejur.
Nu, prefer Casa Mercur.
Dacă vreți un loc liniștit, dacă vă doriți o plajă neaglomerată, dacă iubiți soarele sau dimpotrivă locurile umbroase, dacă vă e dragă limpezimea apelor, dacă vă place o plimbare cu barca, dacă vreți să vă odihniți peste zi sau peste noapte, dacă optați pentru servicii de excepție pe tot parcursul zilei, toate acestea le puteți găsi la numai câțiva kilometri de București, la Căldărușani, unde firma Trident consideră că nimic nu e prea scump pentru ca oaspeții săi să se simtă bine. La telefonul 37...
Cerul e mai sus, e mai sus decât noi.
Dincolo de cuvinte e tehnologia.
Semănătoarea ESA vinde combine de recoltat cereale cu credite oferite de BCR și Bancop în condițiile hotărârii guvernamentale 352 pe 1995 cu dobândă subvenționată în proporție de 70% producătorilor agricoli individuali și celor cu personalitate juridică, inclusiv arendașilor stabiliți conform legii 83 pe 1993.
Dacă apar manifestări neplăcute, adresați-vă medicului sau farmacistului.
Dincolo de cuvinte, sunt sentimentele.
Și sunt sentimentele.
Sunt pisica penthouse a lunii iunie. Vrei să auzi povestirile mele erotice și ale celorlalte pisici?
Crezi că va? Părerea mea, eu cred că da.
Sună la 0238 402 496.
Cristin are carne din plin.
Ești expert în sâțe? Câștigă milionul. Sună acum și spune ale cui sunt.
Da, bunii mei, sunt eu, Mircea Albulescu, și vă sfătuiesc să faceți ca mine.
Eu sunt Stella Popescu. Asta o știți deja.
Sunt Mariana Broescu, dar cititorii mei îmi spun doamna Casa Lux.
Scump, doamnă, scump! Dincolo era mai ieftin.
La rândul meu ofer în fiecare an trofeul doamna Casa Lux celor mai frumoase case și grădini din România. Trofeul doamna Casa Lux.
Impecabil, imbatabil.
A început vara de aur Tubor.
O experiență intensă ca viața de român.
Asta e viața, frățioare. Cine fură, îl are.
Это же русская водка.
Ошибка. Это дак, румынская водка.
E de ajuns să-l bei o singură dată pentru a te îndrăgosti de el.
Gustul perfecțiunii și perfecțiunea gustului.
Ce faci dacă ți-e foame? Pur și simplu mănânci.
La zuppa è squisita.
Lo puoi dire forte, caro, sarà la pasta che dà tutto il buon gusto.
Paste făinoase extra, produse la Craiova.
Danke scoate neamțul din tine.
De pe vremea marilor butării germane, nimeni n-a mai făcut pâinea asta. Numai ce n-a gustat, nu știe ce bună este.
Singurul japonez, sigur, accesibil.
Royal Loyalty.
Plăcere fără frontiere. Ce faci dacă ți-e somn? Pur și simplu dormi.
Elba, lumina care te înconjoară.
Țas, plăcerea de a privi.
Eu sunt Simona și sunt atât de plină de pasiune. Unde sunteți voi, armăsarilor?
Uite, Joja! Joja!
Mai mare plăcerea să-l atingi.
Sunt eu însămi și îmi place să câștig. Cu părul meu câștig încredere în mine.
Nu par dor din cauza la sprâncene. Dacă mă încrun, toată lumea se teme.
De asta miroase că ai cam cheltuit ceva.
Cauți o afacere solidă și de viitor? Dorești să investești, dar nu știi unde. Dorești să-ți asiguri bătrânețea, dar și copiii? Nu știi ce să faci cu certificatul de acționar? Dorești să ai un venit satisfăcător și permanent? Vrei să-ți pregătești de pe acum viitorul?
Dina, nu se pune în mână.
Rămâneți cu noi să vedem dacă va trece testul gospodinelor.
A trecut testul?
Da.
A trecut testul!
A trecut testul!
A trecut testul! A trecut testul!
A trecut testul!
A trecut testul!
A trecut testul!
A trecut testul!
Sunt fericit să putem petrece împreună Sfintele Sărbători de Paști.
Trimite cuvântul fantezie prin SMS la 1619.
Marfă.
Okay, I have to follow that. I have this strange desire to buy some farming machinery, but instead I'll focus on this. Okay, so firstly, a massive thank you for the invitation and also for the organisation of this event. It's a real thrill to be here and to be part of the discussion today. I'm going to dive straight in. So, a few years ago, I was working in the state archives in Ghana and came across a letter catalogue and leaflets addressed to the country's Director of Education from the UK's Daily Mail School Aid Department. Now, the letter, which you can see in the middle, written in August 1952, promoted the Daily Mail's role as a producer of more than 200 film strips, which made it the second largest producer of educational film strips in the UK. And it also advertised a new film strip for teachers around the world entitled Coronation, Its Ceremony and Regalia, which you can see on the left. Now, the find was intriguing to me for a number of reasons. Here we had one of Britain's best-selling and most outspoken conservative newspapers with an educational department teaching children and adults at home and overseas. It revealed the global spread of film strips as part of nation and empire-building projects, a media empire working in part to preserve an imperiled British Empire. And on closer inspection, it also revealed the scale of film strip production and distribution across the mid-20th century. So this led me to set up a network project in 2021, working with archives across the UK to locate these 35mm film strips, which on a very basic level often comprised a series of still images accompanied by a detailed commentary booklet, so the kind of sound and image separated in this way. And what we discovered was an often familiar, repeated story of a media form that was largely forgotten and neglected, hidden in the footnotes or misplaced in the recesses of the archives. Now, in most cases, the archives were unaware of their collections. The very first place I went to watch one of the film strips tried to set me up on a microfilm machine instead, which wouldn't have worked, so there was a kind of immediate sense that the archives themselves didn't know what they had. While also the connected materials were invariably broken up and dislocated across departments and archives. So this raises, I think, a number of related questions for us today. Firstly, why are film strips largely forgotten today? What is their place within archives and global histories? And related to this, how can we listen to and retrace the sounds of the film strip today? So let's start by trying to explain what the film strip actually is, as this will go some way to explaining why the film strip has been disregarded within the archives. What better way to do this than through a short clip from a British Army film made in 1943 promoting the use of visual aids in military training.
But there are some things you can't do with the film. You can't always stop it. Which is hard luck on the instructor who would like to arrest the movement occasionally, like this, in order to explain some point more fully. Moreover, you can't easily bring a film up to date, and occasionally when some piece of mechanism has been changed since the film was made, the instructor would like to do this, and thus be in a position to show exactly where the new type differs from the old. This is where the still picture comes in to help the moving one. With this simple gadget and its film strip, you can review all the important points of the film you have just shown. You can hold any picture or scene as long as you wish. Discuss any point. Question the class. Or go back. But above all, the film and the film strip have the advantage of using the vision channel to the brain. The clearest, most lasting, and quickest way of instructing.
Okay, there's another 20 minutes of that, but you get the idea. The visual channel of the brain, we've learnt that. Okay, great. So one way to think about this then is, what is the film strip? Or perhaps more importantly, what is it not? I've found it categorized with film, with photography, as art. We might equally think of it alongside print media and books. As I'll discuss later, it's also can be seen alongside radio, and of course as part of a live performance and show. In effect, it is all of this and none of this, because film strips are, by their nature, intermedial, used alongside films, photographs, wall charts, books, pamphlets, and they were never meant to be used in isolation, but are one part of a much wider media infrastructure. Now, while their value may come in dialogue with other forms, they're more often displaced and disconnected within archives, divorced from the booklet or wall chart or posters that would traditionally have accompanied them. Now, one example that we found that maybe counters this slightly is at the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading, which almost inadvertently holds the company records of Common Ground, the largest post-war producer of film strips in the UK. Now, the museum was totally unaware of these collections after it was absorbed as part of a wider publishing archive that they hold. So here, though, we can start to see the different parts and processes of the film strip together. So you have images, scripts, contracts, original cells, film strips, all the different parts together here. But examining the film strip ultimately requires a collaborative approach. So I've worked with a number of archives already, and we can see here the Science Museum group holds the equipments and technologies to play film strips, which is a huge obstacle for other archives. The British Library holds hundreds of commentary booklets. The BBC holds accompanying radio recordings. The British Film Institute holds the journals, magazines, company catalogues and books that discussed, reviewed and shaped the field, while the Institute of Education holds government reports on their use. Now, each part on their own is, if not kind of useless, then at the very least incomplete. And what's more, the film strips are interdisciplinary. They connect across disciplines, draw on expertise from multiple fields, but as a consequence are also in some respects homeless. They were used in multiple ways, from training dinner ladies to sex education. I should probably stress that's not one single film strip, those are different film strips. There was actually a Daily Mail produced a 3-part film strip entitled How I Teach Sex, which, spoiler, the answer is really badly. And they kind of emphasize, they kind of privilege the morality, and it's all about morality and, you know, social convention and what you're supposed to do and social values. But we also have a collection used for US diplomacy. So, for example, a series of film strips on American history and culture, which were brought over by the US government and gifted to the UK Ministry of Education, along, crucially, with film strip projectors for showing in schools in Britain at the end of the war. And again, a clear example of one of the uses of film strips in the post-war period as this kind of form of soft power. Now, the film strip's interdisciplinary and intermedial nature may partly explain its displacement within archives. There is, in effect, no film strip department or film strip curator. As a result, we have these kinds of strange paradoxes that circulate around the film strip. Film strips are everywhere and nowhere. They're lost and they're abundant. And the image here comes from a display at the V&A Design Museum, which included a film strip as part of an exhibition on tartan and on Scottish identity. Now, the film strip appears with absolutely no explanation. Instead, it's just a display piece, a kind of pretty object divorced of any context. So I guess the follow-on to this is, where should film strips fit within archives? Who is responsible for them? Now, film strips fit within or are absent from a much wider media history, one that stretches from lantern slides to the PowerPoint I'm using here today, and that equally connects with modern informational and kind of how-to short video forms as well. But it's of course important to remember that this is a messy history. It varies across countries and is not teleological, as the film strip overlaps and works with other media forms throughout its history. Indeed, film strips were central to the development of visual education. They were a truly global phenomenon, especially widely used across Eastern Europe, South America, and indeed the British Empire, as the opening example from Ghana shows. And indeed, after the war, film strips were often more widely used than film across the British Empire. So by the start of 1953, the local film strip library in Jamaica held 1,200 film strips, and these film strips worked in direct conjunction with the 16mm films that were being produced by the Jamaica Film Unit. So, for example, the first film made by the Jamaica Film Unit was called Farmer Brown Learns Good Dairying, and there was a film strip made that accompanied that with 44 images and a booklet explaining each image. So again, these were always imagined in conjunction there. And Martin Reynolds, who was the head of the Jamaica Film Unit, described the film strip as, quote, a necessary adjunct and support of films, seeing this as part of a total communication package. Now, the Colonial Film Unit's George Pearson, training colonial filmmakers in London, explained that film will only succeed if it adds to its armament the film strip, visual aids, and best of all, he said, actual demonstration. So Pearson outlined the specific function of film to stir interest, while film strips, he said, drive the lesson home. So these, again, were working in conjunction here. Now, I recently uncovered a set of more than 50 film strips at the National Library of Scotland, which were made by the Colonial Office between 1948 and 1957, effectively in the kind of last decade of the British Empire. Now, many of these titles seem to me very familiar, having worked extensively on colonial film. So, in fact, many of them were way too familiar. They were titles that I'd watched or that I already knew about from my earlier research. Now, what I also quickly found was that these film strips would feature in colonial catalogues and at training schools used alongside films, books, wall charts and posters, one part of this much wider media infrastructure. And here we see some of the related images found at the National Archives in London, posters and booklets that are not collected alongside the film strips, but which speak directly to them. And then as part of this work, I started to try and match materials across archives to think about how we might connect and visualize this infrastructure. In this sense, the film strip was never meant to be alone, and so it's often orphan status in the archive, while speaking of the kind of historical collecting practices and archival structures can only really be addressed by collaborating across collections, materials, and institutions. Now, one further point that emerges from this is that we often see the same images and text reused and recycled across media forms, from photographs to posters to film strips. Now, this repetition, I would argue, is both a pedagogical device and a significant feature of the film strip. So the incessant, and it is pretty incessant, repetition of often unremarkable images and text across film strips, wall charts, textbooks, posters, pervades public and educational life. It provides this kind of sensorial diffusion of messaging and branding. And we tend to focus, I think, on the exceptional and the original, but film strips are often kind of remarkably unremarkable. This repetition, inviting repeat viewings, almost like a loop, also kind of recalls more modern devices as well. So I think this sense of this media being everywhere, just being in some ways under attack from these images and sounds and the same text that you're seeing again and again. And I think this repetition may also explain the widespread use of the film strip in government propaganda projects as a media form that was used to reinforce reductive assumptions about colonial audiences. For example, an audience survey on film strips in India claimed that as villagers' minds work more slowly, quote, there should be a regular repetition of ideas. So in this way, we might understand the film strip as a distinctly colonial form. On account of their cheaper cost, their versatility, their perceived simplicity, film strips became arguably the dominant form of visual education in many of these areas after the war, and also one that was widely championed by UNESCO. So the Ministry of Information, for example, in the UK, argued that film strips were, quote, particularly useful for unsophisticated audiences who sometimes find the rapid movement of cinefilm difficult to follow. While in Gambia, where the film strip was widely used, it represented an earlier stage of audience development, presented as, quote, an initial step in educating illiterate primitive people to appreciate cinematograph films. And a UNESCO report on mobile cinema vans in 1949 argued that the value of the film strip, quote, was at least as great as that of films, as the colonial viewer needs time to to become accustomed to the conventions of film. So we can see the kind of language that's already being used and built up around this media form. And William Sellers, who was the producer of the Colonial Film Unit, often favoured the film strip's ability to convey detail and a single message to its audience. So in this way, the film strip effectively represented the manifestation of his specialised technique, this idea that clear instruction was needed, privileging a lack of movement, no distractions on screen. And this was seen to be particularly suited to his imagined colonial audiences. However, William Sellers rejected the notion that the film strip was simply a debased form of the moving picture, arguing that film appeals initially to the eye and the film strip to the ear. And I think this is important in the context of this event, and indeed in how we experience the film strip within and outside the archive today. So for Sellers, film was a visual medium with the commentary used to support this, while the film strip was an audio medium with the visuals supporting the spoken word. And this presents a particular challenge for archives and researchers today. The film strip is an incomplete media form, while the commentary booklet represents the intention rather than the experience, as we discussed in the panels yesterday. You know, this is incomplete. This can only tell us what the government wanted to be said rather than what actually was said. Now, I've argued elsewhere about the pivotal role of the local commentator in mobile film shows, organising and directing both the film show and the audience responses to the images on screen, often appearing as a kind of travelling showman or performer operating outside the direct control of government and absolutely moving away from the intended script. Now, while archival records, and the ones here from South America, may reveal attempts to control the experience, the film strip was also celebrated because it was adaptable. It gave voice to the teacher or instructor who could respond to both the images and their audience. And there were also other initiatives to bring together sound and image. So here we have BBC Radio Vision, which ran from about 1964 to 1990, and it paired film strip with radio broadcasts and then later with tape recordings. What would happen is there would be a radio broadcast at 11 o'clock in the morning, which would be scheduled, and schools would line up their film strip to play alongside the radio broadcast. So it was absolutely presenting a kind of a link between the audio and the visuals here. Now, the importance of sound to the film strip is evident in the Daily Mail materials that I opened with today, and they remind us of the more varied and innovative ways in which traditional print media companies sought to address and speak to the public. So the Daily Mail is not the only newspaper that has film strip departments. The New York Times has one for about 50 years, from the 30s to I think the late 80s. They were running their film strip department. So was the Sunday Times in the UK. And the film strip reminds us in this way of the varied ways that news and nation building was packaged for audiences, whether at home, in schools, or in public spaces, as education or entertainment through distinct but related media forms. Indeed, while we think of the Daily Mail as a newspaper, these images remind us of the ways in which print media was always innovatively using sound to infiltrate public life. So the image here on the left is of the earliest Marconi experiment with radio in 1920, Nellie Melba performing, and that was sponsored by the Daily Mail. The classical concerts you can see in the top right here, that was from 1922, again sponsored by the Mail, organising these concerts across Europe. Here we have in the top right, the Daily Mail's public broadcasting of the King's Speech in 1924. They'd also put on big events around major sporting events as well. We also have here the Daily Mail wireless vans, which would tour the country with their loudspeakers. They even chartered a Daily Mail yacht, to travel the country in 1928. It sounds absolutely terrifying. Visiting seaside resorts throughout the country, blaring out music and messaging to kind of unsuspecting holidaymakers stuck on a beach. But in this way, we must understand sound as an essential but often displaced part both of print media and more broadly of the film strip. And I think this presents particular challenges when trying to preserve and digitize these materials. I can reassure this is the end in case you're wondering about timings, we're fine. This presents particular challenges, I think, here. You can see here how we've experimented with the digitization process. Firstly, looking to record the materiality and not just the image, but also questioning how we can revisit what was as much an audio as a visual experience, bringing these media forms together. Now, ultimately, this is a kind of messy and contradictory media form. It's everywhere, it's nowhere, it's lost, it's abundant, it's invisible or inaccessible within archives, it's dispersed, it's a partial, imperfect record. Its very nature, its kind of dull and repetitive nature, was fundamental to its pedagogical workings and its place as a media of empire. So ultimately, the film strip is an integral and hugely significant part of 20th century education, governance, and popular culture. But it's also an example of the challenges for archives, artists, and media historians in retracing these intermedial forms and reconnecting the retrievable image from its ephemeral, seemingly lost sounds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those very thought-provoking presentations. And, well, I was curious about the TikTok link, but we can discuss this later. I think, and just to sort of bring the two together in terms of how they appear to me, is what you mentioned about voice, right? And I'm thinking about there are multiple things here. There's the idea of voice, but words, with the printed word, the subtitle word for us, and also then sound or speech in that sense. And I think in your presentation, the sense that I got was that, of course, the voice that is constantly in our minds is the voice against which the advertisements are locating themselves, right? Speaking against the grain of what the patronizing voice against which they are. And in your case, I think it's the voice of the empire, right? So I would, and therefore, I'm actually interested in these moments where there are these infractions, which would be there in live performances or live, and also in your case, your own work, the way you have managed to edit the film. So locating those infractions or, non-compliance against that voice. I think it would be interesting to start thinking about, if you'd like to.
Is this working? Yep. Oh, great. Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the challenges is that the printed record, as we said, is only showing intent rather than how it was experienced. And I think the nature of the film strip, the fact that it was cheap was part of the appeal for the government across the empire in the 40s and 50s. It's kind of, in some ways, it is representative of the crumbling empire, the fact that they turned to the film strip as a form as well, rather than more expensive media forms. But I think you're right that trying to retrace that voice is a challenge, but it's also, certainly when I was looking at film shows, you find it in strange places. So there's an article from 1941 that discusses how you should address a film show, and it says, in order to get the crowd's attention, you should ask a question to which the obvious answer is yes. And it says such a question might be, are you proud to be British? And 10 years later, the same article is published. It's reprinted, but there is one change, and the change is when you gather an audience, you should ask a question to which the obvious answer is yes. Such a question might be, are you okay? And they have
And so, you know, immediately you can tell within that period, okay, this is what's changed. There is an awareness of how you are addressing that audience, of what you need to say to that audience. And I think we see that in film strip records as well. There are, as you can imagine with the British government, there are a lot of records of intent, of saying this is how it is working, and often with reports coming back from officials overseas claiming that it's a big success and everything else. But actually there are plenty of opportunities to read between the lines and to see where there is that discrepancy. And I think the fact that there was such an attempt to control, I think, you know, these booklets are an attempt to say this is what you should say, this is how you should do it. But at the same time, it's a media form that was adaptable, that was inviting, you know, you could change out an image, you could do these things. There was more room for the teacher, and it was presented as something that gave voice to the teacher rather than, you know, something where you sit back and watch it. So I think its fundamental form suggests that there is, you know, more room for discrepancy there.
Yeah, thank you. So, indeed, I think that one thing that shines through these materials is sort of their constant implicit dialogue with what was going on before, and this sort of implicit criticism, which you can see in the way that this sort of monotonous communication device that you had throughout the socialist period breaks into this kaleidoscope of diverse voices, products, modes of presentation, and so on. And because I mentioned this connection to found poetry, and also Brian Joseph Davies' work, he has this project that is titled Voice Over, and where he assembles very long poem in prose out of the taglines from American Hollywood trailers. And well, there is a printed, a textual version of that, and also an audio version where he reenacts the vocal performances of that. And it's interesting to contrast the two, because when you look at the written material, it looks very poetic. So you can still see the tone, the sort of the climatic tone of the trailer slogans and the way they are assembled, but they are melted into something that is very harmonious. Whereas if you listen to the voice, to the audio file, it's not at all harmonious. So it's splittered into this sort of an amalgam of things that don't really work together, but it also show their source much more overtly. And in a way, we had the same thing with our found poem, whatever. We also had a textual version when assembling it, and it looks far more poetic than this, whereas it becomes completely splittered when you watch it like that. But it also shows, well, other connections in a way.
And you're both involved with archiving projects, so building archives around these projects. And what comes across in both your work is that, I mean, you mentioned it very clearly, the intermediality, right? But even in your case, at least the advertisements are referencing both obsolete technology, right, or ways of, and also access to other technology like telephone. And I'm wondering if you also think about the way you're going to work with these archives, or you build these, if intermediality and or the references to obsolescence is going to be a concern, or is it of interest?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great question. I think on the one hand, you know, I'm talking about film strips as a media form, but at the same time saying we can't look at them on their own. And I think that's a challenge with projects as well, is that there's a tendency to focus on, you know, the object or the item that you are working with, whereas actually what I'm trying to show with the film strip is that it's about the infrastructures and how we connect materials that are, for varying reasons, have fallen into different archives at different times. And, you know, I first came across a bunch of booklets in London without finding their film strips. Now, on the one hand, you can still do work with those materials, but there's a kind of limit to what they tell you. And I think, as I mentioned in the paper as well, the kind of repetition is important. The fact that we do see these same images being reused. So if you went into you went to an event and there is a poster up, but there is also the film strip, and there is also, the idea that these images and these messages are being relayed to you in different ways and at different moments. Some might be there for months, others you might see just once. But I think this understanding how this works across the space is really important there. So trying to focus on the film strip, but without kind of sacrificing how it operated and how it was situated at the time. And on the obsolescence point, absolutely. I think also understanding why it kind of disappeared in a way is important, because for so long it really was a dominant media form, and yet very quickly, certainly in the UK, very quickly it's not really discussed, it's not really even referenced. And that to me was intriguing, because when I was researching on the Empire particularly, I kept on coming across these references to film strips, and it was always one of those things, it was like, at some point I'll think about that, or I'll find out more about that. And so I guess I just got to a point where I was like, I need to answer this question.
Yeah, so indeed, intermediality, I think, plays a huge part in this, because, I mean, from the onset, most of the materials that we used are basically television advertisements, so that they work within television. But in the specific context of the 1990s, television itself was a very composite medium in Romania. So you had, of course, these sort of images that were sort of documentary materials, shot more or less in the same way that you would do that in, I don't know, during the 1980s or 70s. But on the other hand, you had all these formats where they actually used still images with a sort of voiceover, like this type of presentation style. They began to use video extensively. So there are really a large set of different formats that they use, different technologies that come to be used, because it's a period of a really chaotic use of technology in the advertising industry, especially in Romania, where they begin to import all kinds of obsolete technologies from the West. They have their own hybridized version thereof from the earlier period. They begin using in this sort of, well, not entirely legal mixture of public and private enterprise. They begin using public materials and public technologies from different institutions to film advertisements and so on. And it's really kaleidoscopic in this regard as well, and intermediate as well.
Go for some audience questions. Oh yeah, we have someone there.
Thank you very much for both of the talks. We really enjoyed it in our corner here. We were laughing a lot. And I was wondering why it's so funny to be able to recognize the distance between what we're listening to and what we're listening to on the radio now. And I want to ask a question concerning the obvious discrepancy between the voice of the empire on the one hand, and then that idea of the necessary embodiment of the voices on the other. Christian, you started with that, observing that Adorno writes from the radio in the United States in the 40s about the radio voice. No? And exactly in the United States, you have those very singular, particular voices, while the British Empire sort of talks through the universal voice of the BBC, where we're always wondering, we always seem to think it's the same voice, and there must be a lot of training and disciplinary training behind this universal voice of the person who sort of represents the BBC Empire, no? Talking to us all the time. So my question is, and I think we are faced with that at the moment where we have those AI voices, which are very general, not at all particular, and even non-binary, talking to us, and we still suspect that there's a subject behind the empire talking to us and shaping our behaviors. No? So my question is to Christian, is it very specific, or is it an exception that that piece you were showing us is spoken by a woman? Because we were talking with Vincent yesterday about the gender of the voice and probably the empire or the Romanian Republic. And I thought it was interesting that that clip starts with a space. We are in space, so it's a hyper-universalizing, but we still have a woman's voice sort of explaining what is going on. And then on the other hand, did you find Tom, any examples of the colonial radio being spoken by a woman, or doesn't that exist? So it's both. It's about the embodiment and the universal, and then about the gender.
Yeah, so thanks for this. Actually, I don't have the actual quantitative data about this, but I think that Romanian advertisements from the socialist period sort of employ 2 or 3 voices, at least one of whom is a woman. So, I mean, it's somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of them, I think, would be voiced over by a woman. I think that there is a slight subtext to this, because I mentioned this sort of attitude of paternalist, patronizing care or concern that shines through from these images. And this is something that is very present, especially in the police films, for instance, or the police instruction films, or the police propaganda films of this period, where they are trying to project this sense of socialist legality. So the abuses of the Stalinist era are long gone, and now we abide by very strict regulations, and the state and the police and also the secret police are basically here to help us, guide us in a very friendly manner. And it might be that the use of a woman's voice is there also to project this sort of warmer attitude and of kindness, in a way, of gently guiding people on the right path, I think. So this might be part of why they do this. But aside from that, they seem to equally employ male and female voices to project this sort of fatherly, motherly attitude towards the consumer, the citizen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because I think on the one hand, having watched a lot of these films, I mean, there were some evenings where I felt like I was going to bed with that voice in my head, telling me what to do. I was thinking, this is, I've watched too many today. And I think there is a sense that the voice becomes dominant in those films. One thing to say is that when they were shown, obviously often the voiceover was still playing even with the commentator there. So there's this sense of a kind of almost like a competition or dialogue going on there. And I think that the tone is still important in that context. The kind of BBC voice is still important. And there were, as you can imagine, like guidelines on what could and couldn't be said, and tone, and all of these elements. The film strip's interesting in that respect because it doesn't have, I mean, later on there are recordings, but actually for a lot of the time it doesn't have a recording. It's a booklet, and so in some ways there is an attempt there to give a voice, but to control and contain that at the same time. So I think there's a kind of interesting dynamic that's going on there as well with the voice. In terms of women involved in the BBC, there are a few examples. They're exceptions, so we know about them often because they are the exceptional. There was a BBC radio show called West Indies Calling, and the host of that was Una Marston, who was a prominent West Indian in London, and but actually more recently she was a kind of figurehead for a while, and then what happened later on to her does not reflect well on the BBC and anything else, I think, particularly. So I think there is a sense that There were a few examples, but they were exceptions, and you're absolutely right. The dominant voice, we all can recognize it and hear it, and that is absolutely a feature throughout this period.
This one at the back.
Thank you very much. I was also kind of chuckling here at the back about both presentations, but I had a question, which is, I think it returns to that issue of where you find the interruptions, and thinking about what Tom was saying about intermediality, but it's also there in Christian's presentation about, you know, a sort of, you're tracking a very large archival corpus and finding resonances and similarities and so on. I was, if you don't, just stay with me for a minute while I tell a short anecdote. Many years ago, I was researching in the archive of Béla Balázs, and I found a wonderful unfinished, he was a well-known writer of fairy stories, and I found a wonderful unfinished fairy story about radio. And it was about two radios in the same room, which the narrator is watching or listening to, and he can't get the right frequency. So one of them is going, and the other one is going, and the narrator starts to speculate about in the way that Balázs had written about the universal language of film, about a universal language of radio, of a radio technology to which he has no access, but which interrupts the kind of circuit of communication. It's a much funnier story than that, but anyway, and he never finished it. But I was just wondering about whether it's perhaps in the relationship across technologies or between texts that you start to find those interruptions. For example, when you're looking at a film strip and then you compare it with those two articles that you were talking about, and suddenly something's changed. So it's a question for both of you about what happens when you start to read across media and whether you can find interruptions at that point.
Yeah, so I mean, the most obvious way that we were using something like this is basically bringing it to the cinema. So there are images intended for television, and which we now bring to the large screen. Of course, this is also due to the state of our archive, because we went to all these private actors, private individuals involved, as I tried to recall a bit in the beginning, and they of course had the material in different states of their preparation. Sometimes they had some distant copy of it, sometimes they had materials which were yet unfinished, and so on. And I mean, if you put all of this together and if you project it on a big screen, all kinds of other stuff come out that were sort of not intended for analysis in first regard. And well, of course, a lot of these images are actually these sort of very poor images. Now, some of them in other parts of the film mostly can now barely be read. They are really like color blots, more or less. And yeah, this sort of interruption comes out precisely because we are sort of transporting it into an entirely different medium, which will be like cinematic projection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned at the end that I'm working on a book at the moment about British newspapers, and the Daily Mail is the main example I'm using because, yeah, why? But actually, part of that is about kind of convergence of conservative media. So it's saying, well, here is what we think of as a print media form, but actually they were integral to, or at least they had a part in the development of radio, film strips, newsreel, the first talkie newsreel. They own 49% of British movie-tone news in the UK. First commercial TV channels in the UK were partly owned by them. So there's a sense of, okay, what happens when we think about this in a more joined up way and put these together? So I think you're right, finding those interruptions, and it absolutely helps coming from having done some of this research in a film context already, because you recognize some of the patterns. And I think that's part of the challenge, is to recognize, this is familiar already, or this is where this is exceptional. And I think that is important, to recognize what's specific about the media, but also in what ways do we not just look for that? Do we actually look for the repetitions and the kind of the ways in which it is continuing what we already know there as well?
Vincent had a question.
Yeah, thanks for the papers. I mean, in the title of the panel, we used the term interpellation, which in Althusser and beyond means the state speaking to the subject, or speaking the subject as, in an interpellation that is an description of a specific social role or a solicitation of behavior. And that, of course, requires authority, and if it succeeds, it's a deed of authority, if you will. At the same time, Erika was sitting back there chuckling. And I think many of us were in a similar situation. And Christian very convincingly told us that the tone of the socialist advertising was one of benevolent paternalism, laced with a threat of a different approach. And that works as long as the threat is plausible. But I would say in the whole dispositif, there is always a potential for ridicule. And things can collapse very, very quickly. And in setting up the film script dispositif, conferring authority on the speaker is actually a challenge. You know, that person has a certain social role, they're gifted or not with a convincing voice. The people they speak to may know them, may take them seriously or not take them seriously. So this is a very volatile situation, and there's always a potential for ridicule. And I mean, part of the work that you did, what I find admirable, by the way, Christian, is that you don't go for the cheap laughs. It's very easy to make fun of that material, and to approach it as sort of a found poetry, and to try to valorize it that way is a much more challenging approach, but it's also a way of dealing with the potential for ridicule. So I would just like you to address the inherent instability of the authority claims of those voices.
Okay, I'll go first on this one. I think, I mean, the first thing I would say, Vincent, is in a way, it doesn't matter if it succeeds. What matters is that they can say it succeeds. So there is a sense that actually there is a way of reporting on this, which is almost more important than what actually happens sometimes, I think, with these media forms. You're absolutely right about the kind of tensions of conferring authority, but it's also something that I think, certainly in the British Empire context in the late 40s, early 50s, there is this move to kind of decentralize and to absolutely not seeing this as necessarily as independence would be, you know, there for Ghana within a decade, but rather to say this is part of a process, a gradual process. And so I think that in some ways this voice becomes a way of mediating and of moderating that process as well. And you do see reports that are specifically talking about, complaining in fact, that audiences would laugh at jokes when they were said by local commentators or teachers, but they wouldn't laugh when they said them. And there's this kind of affront of, oh, so this is how we have to get the message across. This idea of using a voice as a way of presenting the message so that it will be received. But you're right, what's not recognized within that is the kind of cultural position of that particular speaker within you know, amongst that audience. So I think that's never considered as it probably should be.
Yeah, I think the question of ridicule is very layered in a way in these materials, because you know, even in the films from the 70s and 80s where there was this veiled element of threat, I'm not sure how many people did find them ridiculous or laughed about them, but we are actually organizing in Bucharest every 2 or 3 months or so. We are organizing these screenings of useful films of various sorts from the 70s and 80s. And people attend them really massively by now. And a lot of them are on very serious subjects. Like we had a screening on philosophy films that were explaining Marxist-Leninism in different ways, or on alternative energy sources, or even these police films that where the threat is not even that veiled anymore. I mean, it's very overt. And there is really massive laughter at this. So, of course, with the historic distance, I mean, people come and they have acquired in the meantime a sort of very campy taste in this sort of material. So, I mean, in a way, the historical reference of the advertisements from the 90s, that sort of contesting dialogue with the communist past and the communist sort of advertising and voice and so on, comes as a further layer on this, on some materials that are already ridiculed. Their own attempt at ridiculing that is not that effective anymore, as are many of the jokes that are implicit in these films from the 90s. Their own attempts at humor sort of are rather cringy now, or are rather difficult to watch, or I mean, their own humor, their own sense of ridicule doesn't really work for us. Other things become ridiculous and so on. So I mean, there are really strata of ridiculousness involved in these materials and in their historical reference, which make them very complex and in a way make them inaccessible to facile ridicule. Just making fun of them and turning them into a sort of joke would miss the complexity of the ridicule that is also already involved and sort of layered and stratified, sedimented in them. Yeah.
Thank you. We need to end the session, and thank you again, Tom and Christian, for your wonderful presentations and discussion.
Okay, so 12:15 is the new 12. We're well within the academic quarter system of German academia. So we will reconvene at 1/4 past.